shortly, but I just want to say a few words to introduce Magdalena. It's lovely to have Magdalena coming to speak to us this afternoon. She's a former student of ours at the UHI. Just completed her PhD last September, I think it was awarded. Nearly a year in, and then went straight away into a postdoctoral position at the University of Vienna. So that was just absolutely excellent to see that happen. So what Magdalena is going to talk to us about today is the research that she was doing as a PhD student here at the UHI, which looked at methods for identifying seaweed eating in domestic livestock in the past. And in particular, she's going to talk about how that research is helping us to understand animal husbandry at the Nest of Brodgar. And I think she's also then going to talk a little bit about her current research at the University of Vienna as well. So over to you, Magdalena.
Yeah, thanks very much also for the introduction. Ingrid was actually one of my PhD supervisors, so it's particularly nice to have her introducing me. This picture of the seaweed-eating sheep on my first slide is also from Ingrid. So I want to start with a quick description of the Nest of Broadca, because that's mostly be talking about sheep from the Nest of Broadca, and not everyone will be fully aware because I also invited my new colleagues. So I wanted to give a bit of background on the site. The Nest of Brodgar is located on the Orkney Islands, north of the UK, and the Nest of Brodgar is part of the UNESCO World Heritage Site, Heart of Neolithic Orkney. The excavation is still ongoing, and it's actually about to start again this Wednesday. Last year there was no excavation because of Corona, so it's very nice to see it finally starting again. The overall date range of this site is not completely clear yet, but it seems like the earliest remains are likely from at least around 3,500 BC, so 5,500 years ago, and final abandonment of the site around 2,500 BC. But this was likely not a constant occupation. There was likely also hiatuses, so the site wasn't used the entire time. The site is located where this oh, that's the wrong button. Where this dot is, so in between the two lochs, Harry and Loch of Stenness. These lochs would have been smaller in the Neolithic, and this here would have also been connected by land. So that's another picture of the site as it looks like, well, present day. And the structures that, here you can see some structures highlighted, and you can see by comparison with the people just how large these were. And this is actually still less than 10% of the full site. The full site is currently estimated to cover around 2.5 hectares, so it's quite large. Here you can see an aerial view, and you can also see quite clearly the structure 10, which is here. This is one of the largest and also most impressive structures at the Nest of Broadca. It's also one of the latest ones. And I'll be talking a bit more about sheep from there as well later. Here you can see an artist's reconstruction of what the Nest of Broadca might have looked like when it was occupied. So there's stone roofs, for which there's also archaeological evidence. And then you can also see here this huge midden heap. So this is like remains of, basically it's old waste, which is very informative to archaeologists. Some of the finds from the Nest of Broadca, which is also what makes this place so special, are incised stones, amber beads, clay figurine called the Brodgar boy, pottery shards that also have some color applications, and at the bottom you can see what this pottery might have looked like. Here you can see a selection of polished stone artifacts from the nest. This is all just very impressive degree of workmanship, and I won't go into much detail here because there's actually a book about this, which you can buy. It has 27 excellent chapters with many good pictures. And it also has 2 chapters on animal remains. And that's what I want to talk about, the zooarchaeological evidence of the animal remains. At the Nest of Broadca, currently excavated, there are around 175,000 fragments of faunal remains. These are mostly cattle and sheep. You can see Ingrid here excavating some from a bone deposit at structure 10. This is one of the most remarkable parts to me about structure 10, where there's a bone deposit that consists almost entirely of cattle tibiae. So that's it's a leg bone, the back leg of cattle. And this was also excavated in quite some detail as well, where individual bones were plotted in 3D, like you can see here. So this would have been one bone, and you can see the alignment of this. So there's been quite some work done on the cattle deposit, but there's been less done on sheep. So part of my research then focused on sheep from the Ness of Brodgar. And as you can probably tell from the title, I focused on teeth, because in this context, basically, I'm the tooth fairy. And so we were wanting to look at the role of sheep at the Ness of Brodgar, whether sheep were kept for meat or for milk, were they brought to the Ness of Brodgar, were they raised locally, how were they kept, what were their grazing and foraging areas. And I focused on teeth because the whole assemblage is so large, with 175,000 remains and still more being dug up, that you had to narrow down to one thing that you wanted to look at. And for me, this was some teeth. So here at the bottom, you can see some present day sheep mandibles. So that's the lower part of the jaw. And on the left, you can see it from the side, and on the right, you can see it from the top. And this is here, this is basically the chewing surface of these teeth. And part of what we wanted to look at is whether sheep were kept for meat or milk, and looking at tooth wear is actually one way to find out how a herd, or what a herd was kept for. And I'll explain this a bit in the coming slides. So about sheep's teeth, mandible, there are incisors which aren't shown on the right here, and then there are 2 premolars there and there, and then 3 molars. So this is 1 tooth, this is 1 tooth, that's the 3rd molar. And looking at these, you can tell how old a sheep was when it died. So here you have 3 examples of sheep, and the top one, you can see there's still 1 tooth missing. So that makes it younger than these 2 because the 3rd molar hasn't erupted yet. And then here you can see a difference in wear because this 3rd molar is still erupting and unworn, and this one is quite worn. So that tells us that this one is the youngest, the top one, and then this one, and then the 3rd one is the oldest of these. And then Sebastian Payne in 1970s developed a method of assigning ages to sheep. And essentially he drew these kind of patterns, and then you can match the wear, and then you get an age at death. This is not completely accurate for all sheep because this also depends on diet, how quickly sheep teeth wear, but you can still get an idea of roughly how old sheep were when they died. And this helps us understand what a herd was kept for, what sheep were kept for. When you have many sheep remains, then you can look at when most of them died. So here you have 3 patterns from also this Sebastian Payne. He had these, they're like examples that you can compare to, and here you can see that for meat, you would expect most animals to be killed between well, in the first 2 years, because this is when they've gained some weight, and then there's not much sense in keeping them much longer if you only want meat. So you would slaughter them. Then for milk, you would slaughter them, well, kill some of the younger animals quite early on, so that there's milk still left for humans, but you would wait for the milk to set in. So that's this curve here. And then I left the wool curve in, but actually in Neolithic Orkney, the sheep wouldn't have been woolly sheep. They would have been a bit like hairy, but not wool in the way that we know it today. So essentially what we can tell from the age of death analysis is herd management, how many sheep were kept until what age. And then you would only keep sheep for reproduction, so some rams and then some more females. And some sheep that you allow breeding selection, so you have some choice in which rams you use. But this is essentially some patterns that you would compare your archaeological patterns to. So for the Nest of Broadca, the mortality profile that we got from 116 sheep teeth looks like this. This is based on mandible fragments, so where there was still some teeth in the mandible, but mostly it's based on loose teeth. And I focused on two specific teeth, the third molars and lower deciduous premolars, the DP4, because these teeth exist in the mandible for a very short time at the same time, and otherwise the deciduous premolar is a milk tooth, so you wouldn't count an individual twice if you use these two teeth. And I also looked at whether the animals at the Ness of Brodgar, whether they were sheep or goat, because that can be quite difficult to distinguish, and well, they were all sheep. So what does this curve mean? Well, we can see that none of these animals died between 0 and 2 months, and quite a lot died between 1 and 3 years. And this looks mostly like meat consumption, dying at this age. But we can also compare this to other sites on Orkney, because comparing to the patterns that I just showed isn't that helpful, because there's a very different climate, because Sebastian Payne worked in, where is today, Turkey. So we need some more local comparisons. So one place that you can compare to is Poole on Sandy. So this is here. This is a multi-period site. And we can compare the Neolithic phases to the Ness of Broadca. So this is drawn in here. There were fewer teeth there, only 31, but you can still see that sheep died at a much younger age at Poole. And this was likely in part due to natural mortality, because you would expect around 20% of sheep to die naturally in their first year, because during birth or then shortly after birth. And additionally, humans might have culled twins to ensure survival of one of the sheep. But we can see that at the Ness of Broadca, we don't really have this natural mortality in the first year. And we can also see that, well, this difference between the Ness of Broadca and the sheep at Poole suggests that this wasn't a local herd at the Ness of Broadca. Likely there were sheep being brought to the Ness of Broadca aged between 1 and 3 years, which would explain why there are more of these older sheep, because otherwise the natural makeup of the herd wouldn't have looked like this. Preservation plays a small role too, or well, it plays a role as well, because small teeth are less likely to be recovered, but still this looks like, well, sheep were being brought to the Ness of Broadca. What does this mean for what people did at the Ness of Broadca? Well, we can tell that this is likely not the result of a simple subsistence economy, but at the same time, there's not quite enough evidence to clearly suggest that feasting on sheep was taking place. So future research will need to look at the amount of burnt bones at the Ness of Broadca, because roasting is much more wasteful than cooking. So in normal domestic settings, so this may be less likely or would be reserved for special occasions. And then looking at marrow bone use, so in domestic settings, you'd expect marrow bones to be boiled afterwards for soups and things. If this isn't done, then that's also a wasteful practice that would be more associated with feasting. But this will be for future work. For me, I continue to focus on teeth. So another thing that we can look at with teeth is what sheep ate. And we can do this with stable isotope ratios. Essentially, you are what you eat, so you're made up of the food you eat and the liquids you drink. So as it already is clear from the title, I'm also looking for seaweed consumption specifically in this teeth, because we already know from modern sheep that they did eat seaweed, or that modern sheep on Orkney today eat seaweed. So this is why I have the example of seaweed here. And there's an isotopic fingerprint in food. And this, when we consume food, goes into the body of people as well as of sheep. And then you can find this in the bone or in the teeth. So we can analyze teeth using isotope ratio mass spectrometry to look at differences in isotope ratios. So what this means in practice is that you take out a tooth from a mandible, or if you have loose teeth, as I had quite a lot, then you have a loose tooth, and then you take samples using diamond drill bits, and you just drill out parts of the tooth, essentially. And then you gain, for each line, you gain some powder, and this is what's analyzed. Of course, well, I'll stay here. The result of this analysis, in the first instance, only gives you numbers, and these numbers, you can't really interpret them without knowing the context. So you need some references, and for archaeology, usually we use modern references. So we use animals where we know what they ate, we analyze these, and then we can compare the archaeological results to these modern results. So for reference material, this was collected on the Orkney Islands, and this was done before my time. The material that was collected for analysis included modern day grass and seaweed from the islands circled here, and also sheep bones and teeth from the island of Rousey, where there's grass-eating sheep, home of Ness, which is very small, as you can see here. These animals consume almost only seaweed, and then on Orkney, where the sheep have access to both seaweed and grass. And these samples were analyzed in order to understand archaeological results. So carbon isotope ratios are given on a scale like this in per mil, and essentially grass eaters have fairly low isotope ratios, carbon isotope ratios, and seaweed eaters have higher isotope ratios, so less negative. And because samples from teeth, they have the great advantage that teeth grow gradually. So this tooth, for example, grows over the space of around 1 year. So you don't only have the diet, well, you have the diet of over the course of 1 year. So each of these lines is one sample, so we get one dot for each sample. And there's some natural variability, so the composition of the plants changes a bit throughout the year. But if you eat seaweed in winter, which the sheep on Orkney do, then you can also see this in the isotope ratios. So essentially, by analyzing sheep's teeth, we can find out not only that animals ate seaweed, but also when. And we can pinpoint the time of year by combining the carbon isotope ratios with oxygen isotopes, which I won't talk about now, but essentially you can analyze the powder at the same time for both isotope ratios. At the Ness of Broadca, these are the results for the sheep, and you can see that, so this is one sheep. All of these are from one tooth of one sheep. And you can see that all the ones that I've shown in blue, they have higher isotope ratios than the ones in grey. And this indicates that these sheep ate some seaweed, and this was also in winter, which we know from comparison to the oxygen isotope ratios. There's one more sheep here, which is shown in pink, that likely also ate some seaweed. Because the shape of the curve matches more these ones than these ones, but it's not very clear. So if you haven't heard about seaweed eating sheep before, this is probably slightly strange. Why were these sheep eating seaweed? So when we look at seaweed, even though many of us wouldn't go to the beach and think food, it actually is food, even to humans. You can eat almost all seaweeds if you freshly pick them. So the consumption of seaweed isn't actually that strange. It's freely available food, and it's also particularly abundant in winter when grass, for example, doesn't grow that well. Additionally, in terms of land use, keeping animals on the shore frees up land for agriculture and also preserves pastures in winter. So it allows having a larger herd on less land. Overwintering is really a particular problem in the north because hay storage is quite difficult because it's quite often quite moist and then the hay goes off. So seaweed consumption is a good solution to that. Additionally, in terms of labor, pasturing on seaweed isn't as much labor as growing crops, particularly for winter fodder. So on Orkney, seaweed eating is really an adaptation to the Northern Isles, where there's a short growing season and scarcity of land, and using the seaweed essentially creates wealth because you're using a resource that wouldn't otherwise be used. But seaweed consumption isn't specific to Orkney. It's not in terms of sheep, but also other animals. So there's historical evidence. I think that's the oldest source that I could find is from Plutarch in Europe, the oldest source in Europe, which describes feeding animals with seaweed in the life of Julius Caesar. Then in the Icelandic grey goose laws, there are specifications of who has rights to seaweed, and it also mentions that if you don't own the land, you may still eat seaweed, but you may not take it from land. Animals feeding on seaweed aren't specifically mentioned there, but this is also a likely use of seaweed. So you can see that seaweed was valued 1,000 years ago in Iceland as well. And then later on, Martin also describes the use of seaweed as a fattening fodder on the Outer Hebrides. And Martin in general seems to have been quite fascinated by seaweed consumption by cattle, because he also wrote this, and I'll just read it all out. The cows often feed upon the alga marina or seaware, and they can exactly distinguish the tide of ebb from the tide of flood, though at the same time they're not within view of the sea. When the tide has ebbed about 2 hours so as to uncover the seaware, then they steer their course directly to the nearest coast. I had occasion to make this observation 13 times in 1 week. So you can tell from this that the cattle were adapted to the rhythm of the tides rather than day and night. And you can also see this on North Runmelsey as well today. And what's also curious about this is that Martin writes that he observed this 13 times in 1 week. And because there's only 2 low tides per day, that basically means he got up in the middle of the night to go watch the cattle go to the seaweed. But as you can see, seaweed consumption isn't specific to Orkney. but today Orkney is most famous for its seaweed-eating sheep. So on Orkney, there's structural and historical evidence from the last 300 years. The picture on the right is also from Orkney. It's called a sheep fort. So essentially it's like a small island in the middle of the sea built by people for the sheep to rescue themselves when they're eating seaweed, that they can, when they're caught out by the tide, they can't manage to get to the shore, that they can still go to these little sheep forts. This one doesn't exist today anymore because it requires upkeep by people, and unfortunately it was eroded by the sea. And archaeologically, there might also be evidence of one, but it's quite difficult to tell because this is, well, it's subject to the sea eroding everything. Archaeological evidence of seaweed-eating sheep also exists, and that's in the form of isotope ratio analyses as well. Most of this was done by Marie Ballas and her colleagues. So here you can see a timeline of various Neolithic Orkney sites, and previous work included the analysis of teeth from Skara Brae and Napa Power, and at Skara Brae, in the first phase, none of the analysed sheep were shown to have consumed seaweed, and at Napa Power, 4 of 11 analysed sheep consumed seaweed. So it seems like at the beginning, when the first animals were introduced, seaweed eating wasn't ubiquitous. But then gradually it seems to have increased, because at Skara Brae, in the following phases, then there is more and more seaweed consumption. And at home of Papua Westray North, which is on a very small island, there's also systematic seaweed consumption by 11 of 11 analysed sheep. So based on what you can currently see, you would expect that at the Ness of Broadca there were quite a lot of seaweed-eating sheep if you expect this kind of linear development. But actually there were only 3, maybe 4 of the sheep that I analysed of the 17 ate seaweed. This suggests that many of the Neolithic Orkney sheep did eat seaweed, but it wasn't a linear progression. And this type of developments have many twists and turns, and it seems like it was a gradual introduction. It's not clear if it was really a physiological adaptation of the sheep themselves, or if it was an adaptation of the husbandry practices, so people leading sheep to the shore. And additionally, the location on the island also plays a role. So I haven't shown them on the map yet, but here you can see some of the sites. So Skara Brae, which is right by the coast today, but back then would have been a bit further, where there were some seaweed eaters, where there was this gradual increase. And then home of Papua Westray North Cairn, which is here, which is on a tiny island there. They all ate seaweed. And then at the Nest of Broadca, this is much further inland, and these 2 lochs, they were freshwater and one gradually turning brackish. So there wouldn't have been seaweed there that we would see isotopically. So this means that some of the sheep from the Nest of Broadca grazed at least 3 to 4 kilometers away. It's very unlikely that they would have brought seaweed as fodder, because it's quite heavy and you'd have to transport quite a lot to feed the sheep. So this difference in diet among the Ness of Broadca sheep suggests that they might have been part of different flocks. Yeah, and then additionally to the sheep, I also looked at red deer teeth. Red deer have kind of a special status, or had a special status on Orkney. Today there are no more red deer on, well, no alive red deer on Orkney. And they appear to have had a special status on Orkney. For example, at Links of Nordland on Westray, which is also Neolithic, well, multi-period, but Neolithic also. 15 red deer were found, and they were heaped on top of each other, lying on the left-hand side and showing no signs of butchery, and they were partly articulated, so they were still kind of as they would have been in life, the bones not taken apart. And there are several other red deer deposits that seem to indicate that they were treated differently to the domesticated animals. At the Nest of Broadca, I went through all the entire collection and looked for red deer, third molars, and DP4s. And in the case of sheep, around 30% came from structure 10, but in the case of deer, all of them were from structure 10. So this is another example where the red deer remains were distributed differently to domesticated animals. The study of the red deer teeth showed no evidence of seaweed consumption by red deer on Orkney, and this is also the case at other sites like Skara Brae as well. So this leads to the question: should we expect these deer to eat seaweed? Would that have is it strange that they didn't eat seaweed? So to answer this, we look at ecological evidence. So seaweed eating in the wild by present day animals. And there is historic and present day evidence from the Isle of Rum, for example, and from the Western Isles of red deer eating seaweed, and also from wild animals in Brittany as well. And this wasn't restricted to northwestern Europe. There's also evidence from Norway and Russia and Alaska of reindeer. And as you can see, seaweed has a great advantage in that it's available in winter when snow covers almost everything else. Seaweed might still be washed to the shore, and in some cases it's just beneath the snow, and the reindeer kind of dig to get at the seaweed, and the seaweed is just available in winter when grass isn't so much. So it is likely a valuable resource to wild animals. But it's not only in cold climates, it's also in hot climates where there's droughts, for example, when there's no terrestrial resources to be consumed. Seaweed, because it's just in the ocean, it always can grow on. And this isn't that well known that so many terrestrial animals eat seaweed, but this is likely also because in present day studies, in ecological studies, they often people work in their own field and they don't look at the boundaries of their field, and so marine ecologists focus on the marine side and terrestrial ecologists focus on that. So this kind of area between the two ecosystems, it's often not looked at, and so this is likely underreported, and there's probably still a lot more animals that we don't know about. So far we know about rabbits and mice and hedgehogs eating seaweed, and here a kangaroo as well. So that the red deer on Orkney didn't eat seaweed is, well, to me it was unexpected. And this could be because they simply hadn't adapted to consuming seaweed, or because there were enough terrestrial resources, possibly because humans somehow fed them because they had special significance. It's really unclear why they didn't eat seaweed. And there's also a suggestion that maybe the red deer were kept from the shore, maybe because there was just too much activity at the shore that they kind of shied away from it. Or there's also suggestions that red deer and Orkney were managed, because it also seems like they were introduced by humans on boats. And in this case, it could also be that the red deer were managed further later on. But this is still subject to future research. So considering I've mentioned how many different animals consume seaweed, the question to ask is, what about humans? Well, we know, most of you will know that there's long ongoing traditions in Asian coastal areas. Probably most people have eaten sushi. And there's also seaweed salads, and seaweed is used to make soups, and it's just generally very tasty. This was also quite common in Scotland and Wales and Brittany. And there's also there's still people eating lava bread in Wales today. So this was also done in Scotland. I have one reference again from Martin, who is also, well, he's always very good with his quotes. And this one is the sea tangle, or as some call it, sea wear, is a rod about 4, 6, 8, or 10 foot long, having at the end a blade commonly slit into 7 or 8 pieces and about 1.5 feet in length. It grows on stone, and the blade is eaten by vulgar natives. So this was around 300 years ago. And this also shows that seaweed consumption then wasn't completely common, because otherwise Martin wouldn't write it in this way. But around 150 years ago, and 150 years later, after Martin, Reverend Lansbury also writes, seaweeds were much eaten by the Highlanders till it was supplanted by the nauseous herb tobacco, and well would it have been for both purse and person if they had continued to prefer it to costly narcotic. So this is 150 years ago, people were eating seaweed. And then there's also seaweed consumption in South America with the Kelp highway hypothesis, which is essentially this idea that the peopling of South America might have been along the coast, because as you go through climate zones, the terrestrial resources would have changed hugely and would have required huge adaptations by people, but the coastal marine resources would have stayed fairly similar. The seaweed types would have changed, but nearly all seaweeds are edible, and as long as you pick them fresh. And additionally, there's also the marine animals. And this hypothesis is backed up by finds at the site of Monteverde, where there were masticated cuds of seaweed, so essentially bits of chewed seaweed, found. So that shows that humans did at least chew them, and it seems well reasonable to think that this could have facilitated the way down. Unfortunately, at the Nest of Broadca, we don't have the type of preservation that we could get chewed bits of food. And looking at isotope ratios also doesn't really help, because human diets are just very complex, and picking out seaweed is also very complex. So currently, with current methods, it doesn't seem possible to find out if humans ate seaweed, because you would easily confuse it with fish, whereas sheep tend not to eat fish. So in this case, we can assume that it was seaweed rather than fish. But if we want to look at other seaweed uses at the Ness of Brodgar, one other thing is looking at the use of seaweed as a fertilizer, which is also something that I did during my PhD. So we wanted to find out if we can tell from the analysis of grains if they were fertilized with seaweed. And again, when looking at archaeological material, it's very important to have modern references. So we did a field trial where we fertilized present-day crops with seaweed. Some of the pictures you can see here. So we collected seaweed at Newark Bay on mainland Orkney near Ness, and at the college we undertook a trial and spread seaweed on some plots, let it grow, and finally harvested it. And here you can see Orkney College in the background. And as you can see here, the fertilization had good effects. So these are the 2 seaweed treatments here, and they were quite a lot higher than without fertilizer. And these were also analyzed for isotope ratios. And fertilization did indeed change the composition of the crop. Further work does need to be done to distinguish the use of animal dung and seaweed, because that currently looks quite similar. But it would be very interesting to see if people were already fertilizing crops at the Nest of Broadca with seaweed, because the whole of the Neolithic is basically just showing people's ingenuity in adapting and using what they have. So it would be very interesting to see if people also use seaweed as a fertilizer. So the groundwork for that is done to some extent, but further research is needed there. But for me, I have now moved to Vienna, where I'm now working, and well, essentially, I am now, well, somewhere here, roughly, and I'm looking at again the beginning of animal husbandry, but in the Balkans area. So this has some similarities to my work on Orkney. Essentially, the Neolithic found animals, cattle, sheep, goat, and pig, which were the first to be domesticated, and that took place around here. These animals were taken by people through Europe, and eventually they got all the way to Orkney. This is around 5,600 years ago, so this is BC. And the people on Orkney, they took kind of the final steps in the adaptation to new environments. And before people reached Orkney, there were already many adaptations that took place before then. So the area I'm studying now is kind of here, the Balkans area. And this is kind of the first time when taking animals from where they were domesticated up north, that there were significantly colder climates. So before there was always this Mediterranean climate. And so this required adaptations and coping strategies for cold winters, for example, and being high up in the mountains and working out where it's better to keep animals mostly for meat or for milk. And also there's different, when you go further north, the light is different, the period of light that you have, and animal rutting is controlled by the light, essentially, photoperiodic control. So people would have had to cope with these kind of changes, because otherwise you might get your lambs too early, for example, and these kind of things. But with all this, it's important to also keep in mind that when we're looking at these adaptations, they're not, the climate doesn't dictate what happens. The environment isn't, people adapt individually. So that's what is really interesting to look at, because there's not one pre-described way of adaptation that needs to happen. So the current project I'm working on is called Farmers Without Borders, looking at ecological perspectives of the spread of animal husbandry from the Mediterranean to Southeast Europe. And as part of this project, I'm again looking at mortality profiles of cattle in this case, and I'm also analyzing bones, and I'll also be looking at residues in ceramic sherds to see whether these sherds contained milk or meat, and from which animals they were. Yeah, and there's just lots of exciting stuff to look forward to, and it ties in quite well with the work on Orkney as well, where just trying to understand past adaptations and why people kept animals in the way they did. And with that, I'd already like to finish, and I'd like to thank very much Ingrid and also my other supervisors for their excellent supervision during the entire time. All my collaborators, Nick Card and Anne Mitchell from Ness of Broadca, who were just amazing, and Marie Ballas, who developed the method of analyzing the teeth, the people from the Agronomy Institute, on Orkney, and also the volunteers, particularly Helen Ayton, who helped me collect all the sheep's teeth from, I think, over 200 boxes we went through to find teeth among 170,000 fragments. That was quite some work. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Magdalena. So it's really nice to hear you summarise all the Ness of Brodgar work and to kind of bring it into context with what you're doing now as well. It's really, really nice. Thank you very much. We have a few questions for you. They're starting to come in, so I'm going to try and, it's quite interesting trying to do it this way. I have to go back through the comments. So we've got one question about red deer in Orkney. And so this is from Jane Ann Dennison, who is wondering, is there any evidence of deer being farmed in Neolithic Orkney, or does the evidence indicate they were wild or hunted only? Okay.
Well, that's really difficult because it seems like they were kind of in between wild and tamed, because it's well, part of it is the introduction of deer. They likely couldn't have swam across, so there's also one paper that shows DNA evidence where it seems like deer were brought to Orkney from outside of Scotland. So there's that aspect, and then farming deer is just very difficult to tell archaeologically because, well, how would you be able to tell if they were farmed? Yeah, but maybe Ingrid has some more to say.
Yeah, I mean, basically, just to reiterate what you said, it's really difficult, and certainly the work that you've done on the isotopes is helping towards that to understand, management through diet. I think is a way to get into this question of domestication, because if they're being treated differently than you would expect in the wild, then that might indicate some form of management or intervention. And Magdalena's work starting to help us go towards that, I think. Yeah. Then you've got another question here about, so this is from Kenneth Boyd. And in fact, Irene Halliburton are asking the same question, I think, by the looks of it. So do you think it would be possible to pick up an isotope/element signature for animals feeding on seaweed fertilized grass?
Yeah, so I've thought about this, but essentially the main difference you'd expect is higher nitrogen isotope ratios. But there's other reasons that you could have higher nitrogen isotope ratios, and that includes fertilization with dung. So you wouldn't really be able to tell the difference between seaweed fertilized crops or grass and dung fertilized crops or grass, but there's also even more reasons why nitrogen ratios could be elevated. So it's not, you wouldn't be able to tell with certainty. And then if you don't want isotope ratios, but instead elements, then element concentrations, that's even more difficult because most elements you can't really use as a marker because they are, well, to some extent it's diagenesis. So material from the soil goes into the teeth or bones, and then we can't analyze that anymore because you don't know what's from the soil and what's from the animal when it was alive. Well, I should probably stop at some point, but it's difficult essentially, and currently no, you can't, but maybe in the future, yeah.
And then there was a related question, which is Irene Halliburton was asking, sheep grazed on coastal grass. Can you pick that up? So again, it's related to.
Yeah, that's similar. So coastal grass probably would have higher strontium concentrations and kind of a marine strontium isotope ratio. So if they didn't eat any seaweed, then you might be able to pick out whether animals ate coastal grass or fully terrestrial grass. But the Orkney Islands are comparatively small, so I don't think that you can distinguish between kind of more inland and more toward the shore, because the effects that you're looking at are too. It's like sea spray coming onto the island, but if there's a storm, the entire island gets sea spray. So, and then there's also the problem that animals wouldn't have stayed on one at one point the entire.
I think we've lost Magdalena there for a minute, unfortunately.
Yes, she did warn me that her internet connection was not the best.
What do you want to do, Maggie? Will we wait a second and see if she gets back?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
There's 2 more questions in the chat that I can see. One about Orkney voles, and what about why did the deer population decline? Oh, and here's a new one at the bottom. Any idea how seaweed affects the fleece? So if she comes back, we've got 3 questions still to ask.
Oh, I could answer the one on deer population. But we'll see.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, I can do that one. So why did the deer population decline in Orkney? Well, we're not 100% sure. There's deer in the Neolithic, there's deer in the Bronze Age, there's deer in the Iron Age, but sometime between the Iron Age and the Viking period, so around about 800 AD, 600, 700, 800 AD, deer stopped being present in Orkney, and we just have to assume that it is human intervention that brought about the decline of red deer, and basically they were hunted to extinction for whatever reason. But the more interesting question is, why did they last so long before before we stopped having red deer? So the suspicion is that there's a change in attitude to deer at that point in prehistory. Either they became much more valuable and interesting, or people didn't actually want them and killed them out. They maybe competed with crops, for example, with land for crops. I think Magdalena might be back now. Magdalena, are you back? I can see that her name's come back in. Can you see that, Raggy?
I'm back. I hope it's sorry about that.
Magdalena, excellent. We've got you back.
Yes, sorry about that. I don't know why it worked fine all the time, and now, yeah. Okay. Sorry.
Did you want to continue answering your question, and then we can go on to maybe just do 2 more questions for you?
Yeah, sure. I already answered it, so I forgot what the question was. Could you repeat?
I think you were talking about coastal grazing and why coastal grazing couldn't be, or how you might identify coastal grazing.
Yeah, so coastal grazing differs from terrestrial grazing in that there is a sea spray effect, so the parts of the ocean, well, water from the ocean comes onto the land, and the elements, for example, strontium is high in seawater, that would come onto the land, and you'd expect a marine strontium isotope ratio on the coastal grass, but on small islands, that effect is kind of difficult to see because essentially the entire island gets sea spray. And additionally, animals would have moved around a bit as well, and then you're looking for a small contribution of, or a contribution of something, but because it's all on a scale, and you usually you get some results and you're not quite sure how to interpret it because there are many different reasons that the values could be in a certain way. So it's difficult to distinguish coastal grass and terrestrial grass. Yeah.
Thank you. And then, so we had another couple of questions. They come flicking up the comments here. So, oh yes, any idea how seaweed affects the fleece? And this is from Julie Anderson.
This hasn't been studied, but I think I would expect similar effects to what happens to the teeth. So I would expect elevated carbon isotope ratios and depending, maybe also elevated nitrogen isotope ratios. But that would be interesting to look at, and I think that could quite easily be done by buying some North Reynoldsy yarn and analyzing it. But yeah, you should see an effect, I think.
Interesting way of sourcing it, wouldn't it? Maybe, sourcing production in Orkney. Right, so we have one last question. I answered one for you in Deer while we were waiting for you to come back. And then where did it go? It's one on voles.
It's Helen Aiton. It's quite high up. Does the presence of Orkney voles in the Neolithic suggest that domestic animals may have traveled directly from Europe rather than through the British Isles?
Yeah. So with deer, there's similar evidence as from the voles. I personally don't know too much about that. Maybe Ingrid wants to reply.
Quite difficult, actually. I think the jury's out on that one, really. I mean, the voles do seem to suggest there's a little bit of coastal hopping, but we don't really know where the animals came from for Orkney yet. The kind of work that Magdalena's been doing on isotopes would maybe help us understand that. If you look at ones further back in time, because Magdalena, you haven't, have you? You've just looked at kind of later Neolithic sheep mostly.
Yeah.
And then I think that's all the questions, but there's lots and lots of nice comments, lots of people saying thank you, very interesting. So yeah, thank you, very interesting. Thank you very much for letting us hear your talk, and yeah, thank you again. A round of applause. and I guess that's it, then we'll let you go unless Raggy has something else that she needs to say at the end.
No, just a huge thank you, Magdalena. It was fascinating to hear about your research, and the next Archaeology Institute seminar will be on the last Friday of August. We're not having one in July. I hope everyone would like to come back then. More info will be on archaeologyorkney.com there at the time.
Thank you very much for having me.